Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2013 Whittington Lecture. My name's Edward Montgomery. I'm the Dean of the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. This event honors Dr. Leslie Whittington, a former professor and associate dean at GPPI, who died in the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, along with her husband Charlie, their daughters Zoe and Dana. Leslie was a beloved member of our community. She joined GPPI in 1996, and during her tenure there, she taught economics and public finance. She was a nationally renowned expert on the marriage tax, and she's remembered quite fondly for her spirited lectures and her engaging personality. We pause each year to honor Leslie's memory and to thank her for her contributions to GPPI as a school. We also each year award a scholarship in her name to a second-year student at GPPI who has demonstrated academic excellence and a commitment to smart public policy. I think Leslie would be particularly proud of this year's winner. This student has demonstrated her excellence in the classroom. She's demonstrated exceptional service to us, the GPPI, as well as to the broader Georgetown and the DC community. And she served on the battlefield for her country, serving in the war in Iraq. Please join me in congratulating the 2013 Leslie Whittington Scholarship winner, Maggie Smith. Maggie? The Whittington Lecture provides a forum for GPPI and Georgetown to engage with leading policy practitioners in a discussion of policy challenges that we confront as a country. These discussions provide an opportunity for Georgetown community to engage in the most critical university function, fostering free and spirited debate, even when those views being expressed contradict our own or those of our institution. Effective public policy, however, requires more than just debate. It requires facts and analysis. It requires a search for solutions. In today's fractious climate, that search for solutions can all too often result in the perfect becoming the enemy of the good. To make compromise or incremental progress a sign of weakness or a failure. This year, we are very fortunate to have with us as our Whittington lecturer, Senator Richard Lugar, someone who has spent his whole career at all levels of government, domestically and internationally, seeking a way to do the people's business, to get things done, even if it meant working with others who don't always share the same views. Senator Lugar hails from Indianapolis, Indiana, where he served as mayor for 2 terms before going on to serve for 36 years in the Senate, becoming the longest-serving member of Congress in that state's history. Senator Lugar, we have gathered a group of proud Georgetown Hoosiers here to welcome you. They're sitting in front of the row, so please welcome them. Senator Lugar is a 5th-generation Hoosier. He holds 46 honorary degrees from American colleges and universities. Those who are working on our first one, we have a ways to go to catch up with you, Senator. Next week, he will add to his long list of honors and accolades when he's presented with an honorary Knight Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire by the British Ambassador to the U.S. I want to congratulate you on that honor, Mr. Senator. For the past 2 decades, he led the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, becoming one of our nation's most respected voices on foreign affairs. His accomplishments during his tenure are far too numerous to list, but he was absolutely instrumental in negotiating the nuclear disarmament of the former Soviet Union. No small feat. Senator Lugar is here today to discuss not an external threat to our country, but rather an internal one that is hampering our ability to do the people's business. He will discuss how partisan vitriol has gripped our political discourse, spreading contempt both between and even within our political parties, and that it's having such a real effect on the policies that we formulate and even on our nation's security. The Senator experienced firsthand the scorched earth approach to campaigning as practiced by some special interest groups and organizations within his own party. The result was a defeat in the primary, but also a loss of a reliable Republican seat in the general election. Regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, we all lose when our elected leaders must fear for their jobs if they work with one another. Reaching across the aisle or making compromises, taken as a character flaw, or or an indicator of a defective policy. When winning trumps doing what's good for our country. These days, bipartisanship is considered a dirty word by far too many of our elected officials. Nowhere is this more evident than in Congress's inability to solve our government's fiscal crisis, or in the fractious debate that took place over Senator Lugar's old colleague's, Chuck Hagel's, nomination fight. As we teach our students at GPPI, it's not just sufficient to have a great policy if the politics of its implementation or adoption cannot be managed. There's no greater threat to almost any sensible policy that we can come up with than our current gridlock brought on by staunch partisanship. Senator Lugar, who joins GPI this semester as a distinguished fellow, knows this firsthand. Hopefully he will share some wisdoms about how we can move through that path and beyond. Senator Lugar, we welcome you.
Well, I certainly thank Dean Montgomery for his very thoughtful and generous introduction, and the Georgetown Public Policy Institute for this invitation to deliver the Whittington Lecture. Having recently been named a visiting distinguished professor at GPPI, I'm especially honored to be a part of this community. And I look forward to many productive endeavors in association with Georgetown and in developing relationships with students and faculty of this great institution. Today, as the Dean has pointed out, we remember Dr. Leslie Whittington, her loving husband, Charles Falkenberg, her two beautiful children, Zoe and Dana. Most Americans still feel a sense of loss when they contemplate the events of September 11, 2001, even if they did not know anyone personally affected. But for the Georgetown Public Policy Institute and others in the Georgetown community who knew Dr. Whittington, the tragedy is still a very personal one. She was an exemplary member of the faculty who performed groundbreaking research and inspired students and colleagues alike. She was devoted to achieving better public policy outcomes and training the next generation of leaders. Our own attention today to important public policy questions pays tribute to her values and her work. Now, when we reflect upon the loss of such talented Americans, I hope that we are inspired to live life to the fullest, to commit ourselves to service, to see each other more generously. I also hope that these positive impulses will prevail in our public discourse and the operation of our government. Indeed, after September 11, a strong sense of bipartisanship and cooperation did exist for a while in our government. Unfortunately, most commentators now see our current era as one of the most partisan in American history. As someone who has been frequently had to contend with the implications, as the Dean pointed, of being labeled bipartisan or moderate, in quotes, I've given some thought in my career to what this should mean. Very often, bipartisanship is mistakenly used as a synonym for moderation or centrism. But one does not have to be a centrist to act in a bipartisan fashion. I've known, in fact, a great many legislators of both parties who held strong ideological views, who nonetheless led bipartisan efforts when the country was in need. Bipartisanship also has been equated with the inclination to cut deals. But in my experience, bipartisanship is not the act of deal-making or even compromise. Almost every day at the United States Capitol, deals are cut as a part of the machinery of legislating. Most of these deals are tactical and are frequently motivated by political calculation. I would define true bipartisanship as the suspension of the pursuit of political advantage in the interest of doing something necessary for our country. Implicitly, it assumes that there are times when politics have to be subordinated to policy objectives, and true bipartisan leaders take electoral risks in the interests of good governance. Now, the founders of our country were realists who understood the power of factionalism, parochialism, regionalism, and personal ambition. They understood that good intentions would not always prevail, and accordingly, they designed a system to check abuse and to prevent power from accumulating in a few hands. But they knew that the efficient operation of such a republic would require cooperation. They knew that it would require most elected officials to have a dedication to governance, and they trusted that leaders would arise in every era to make their vision work. They understood, in short, that achieving effective governance in a republic requires bipartisanship. Unfortunately, bipartisan acts have been scarce in recent years. As a result, our national political culture has produced mostly temporizing results or no results at all. The few major initiatives that have been enacted were often the product of partisan steamrolling, such as the 2010 Affordable Care Act, or they were reactions to obvious failures that had already manifested themselves, such as the 2010 Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Bill. Our system is producing fewer leaders who are placing legislative accomplishment above ideological purity. We have seen innumerable examples of both parties failing the most basic tests of governance. Congress could not avoid the current sequestration, despite broad agreement that it was a problematic outcome. Nor has it been able to pass a joint House-Senate budget resolution for the past 4 years. Even more concerning, partisan sensibilities are dominating Congress's examination now of foreign policy, which traditionally has been characterized by a higher degree of bipartisan cooperation. Therefore, it's important to ask whether today's partisanship is merely the cyclical intensification of a common condition of American democracy that echoes back to the beginnings of the Republic, or whether it's the source of fundamental dysfunction within our government that requires not just awareness and patience, but a solution. Now, my own view is that our current partisan atmosphere is unique in character, if not intensity. More troubling, it is unlikely to recede without a concerted effort to change our political culture and institutions. Under perfect conditions, we would not only govern, we would execute a coherent strategy that responds to fundamental changes in the global order that demand our attention if the United States is to remain competitive and secure. The list of such changes is long, but it starts in Asia with the rise of China and India as economic, political, and military powers. The Obama administration has conspicuously announced a pivot to Asia. At the center of this pivot is China, which exists as both an adversary to certain U.S. interests and a fellow traveler sharing mutual goals and vulnerabilities on others. The ongoing challenge will be for the United States to discern, sometimes issue by issue, whether China is an adversary or a partner. This collaboration will impact America's relations with the rest of Asia and may ultimately determine prospects for war or peace. More broadly, we face the specter of global resource constraints, especially deficiencies of energy and food that could stimulate conflict and deepen poverty. We have made startling gains in domestic energy production, but we still remain highly vulnerable to our dependency on oil. And perhaps equally important, even if we are able to produce more energy at home, which we are doing, we cannot insulate ourselves from energy-driven shocks to the global economy. In other words, we have to cooperate with other nations in improving the global system of manufacturing and moving energy supplies. Currently, a key to this is helping to ensure the completion of the Southern Energy Corridor, serving Central and Southeastern Europe, and unleashing our own liquefied natural gas exports to address the energy vulnerabilities of our closest allies. The potential global crisis over food production is less well understood, whereas research is opening many new frontiers in the energy sphere. The productivity of global agriculture will not keep up with projected food demand unless many countries change their policies. This starts with a much wider embrace of agricultural technology, including the very controversial but very necessary, in my judgment, genetically modified techniques. The risks of climate change intensify this imperative. Even as we deal with potential resource constraints, our country remains vulnerable to terrorism and asymmetric warfare. Access to the internet and social media has deeply altered international politics, in most cases for the better, but it also has contributed to instability through sudden upheavals like the Arab Spring. It has allowed destructive terrorist movements like Al-Qaeda to publicize themselves. It makes information related to the development of weapons of mass destruction more accessible. It's intensified the risk of cyber attacks and espionage. The potential for a major terrorist attack on American soil, employing weapons of mass destruction, is still very real. In addition to the horrific loss of life, such an attack could set back economic growth by a decade or more. Now, having devoted considerable time to this problem, my experience is that there are no silver bullets. Protecting the United States from weapons of mass destruction is a painstaking process that every day must employ our best technology, diplomatic and military tools. Responding to these strategic concerns requires, first and foremost, a stable, growing, and competitive United States economy. Currently, partisan failures of governance have prevented the construction of a rational economic program that reduces the deficit in the short run, maintains economic growth, and enacts substantial reductions in long-term entitlement commitments. Now, during the next few months, our government will undergo a difficult test that will determine if there are enough bipartisan votes to pass a budget deal that will achieve any of these objectives. Clearly, enacting a long-term budget is important for our domestic welfare. Failing to construct a credible deficit reduction plan carries extreme risks as markets and managers look for assurances that the United States is prepared to arrest the long-term fiscal spiral. Given the recent upheaval over Europe's debt crises, further signs that the United States is incapable of addressing the fiscal solution could have dire consequences for our economy. But we should also see budget deliberations as a national security problem, because our current economic posture leaves us highly vulnerable to both economic and national security disasters. The President should regard the conclusion of a comprehensive budget deal as central to his commander-in-chief duties. The budget plans put forward contain no provisions for economic and national security shocks in the coming years. That is not a criticism, because one never builds disasters into long-term budgets, but the odds of us traversing the next decade without an unexpected shock are extremely small. A glance at recent history shows that such shocks as wars, catastrophic terrorist attacks, financial meltdowns, natural disasters, and pandemics are a part of modern experience. Consider that in just the last 12 years, we've experienced 3 unexpected economic shocks in the United States that almost any observer would classify as severe. These were the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the 2005 Gulf Coast hurricanes, the 2008-2009 financial crisis. The necessary response to each of these catastrophes included large public expenditures that deepened our budget problems. These do not even include the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which were undertaken with some deliberation. Now, one might take the view that this string of events was merely bad luck, unlikely to be repeated. But that's belied by the fact that we also experienced many near misses, including terrorist plots that were thwarted, natural disasters that could have been worse. Two natural disasters in Asia, the 2004 tsunami and the 2011 Japanese earthquake, both impacted the global economy, even if the severity for the United States was not debilitating. Moreover, a list of potential catastrophes that could hit us in the near term is especially sobering. These include the possibility of war with Iran over its nuclear program, a nuclear confrontation with North Korea, regional upheaval in the Middle East emanating from chaos in Syria, the terrorist acquisition and use of some of Syria's chemical weapons, a virulent flu epidemic emanating from Asia, massive food shortages that endanger political stability in key countries, or a rapid descent of the European financial crisis. The bottom line is that we are living in a volatile world where we can expect events to occur that will require a decisive response from our government to prevent loss of life, long-term economic damage, or grinding insecurity. If our budget is so constrained or our political system so partisan that we cannot respond adequately, we are setting ourselves up for some very hard times. Now, I've not come today to offer a gloomy scenario. We do have the capacity to prevent and to respond to all of this. The fundamentals of American society still offer the best hand to play. No other country has the same quality and variety of post-secondary education. We have the broadest scientific and technological base, the most advanced agricultural system, the most influential culture in the contemporary world. Our population is younger and more mobile than in most other industrialized nations. We still flourish in this global marketplace if we nurture the competitive genius of the American people that has allowed us time and time again to reinvent our economy. We should see education, energy efficiency, access to global markets, the attraction of immigrant entrepreneurs, the production of increasing food supplies, and other factors as national security issues. Most of these elements, especially free trade, energy efficiency, and immigration reform, need not have a negative effect on the United States budget and may in fact generate revenue for our government and savings for businesses. I would underscore that no attempt to gain the maximum strategic advantage from our human resource potential should fail to enact comprehensive immigration reform that resolves the status of undocumented immigrants and encourages the most talented immigrants to contribute to America's future. But our hard-won advantages will be severely undercut if we fail to put our fiscal house in order. And that will require a transcendent act of bipartisanship by President Obama and the Congress. If both sides reflexively attack the budgets of the other, positions will harden. In that event, we are likely at best to get another temporary budget fix that leaves most major economic issues still unresolved. After the President's State of the Union address, I noted that although the entirety of the speech was partisan, he had included a few lines regarding entitlement reform that Republicans should seize upon as an opening to productive budget discussions. Over the weekend, Senator Lindsey Graham had a similar reaction to the broad outlines of the President's budget in advance of the formal release of that budget tomorrow. Senator Graham cited the President's apparent willingness to slow down cost of living increases for entitlement programs as a potentially significant development that could be a starting point for progress. Similarly, House Budget Chairman Paul Ryan, the Whittington Lecture Speaker last year, commended the President, quote, for challenging his party on entitlements, end of quote. Now, such statements may not seem that significant, but in the context of the unrelenting partisanship that has dominated recently, they are conspicuous openings that should be embraced by the White House. President Obama must attempt to establish a much closer working relationship with Congress that gives those members who are inclined toward bipartisanship some assurance that their sacrifices can lead to productive outcomes. Such cooperation is necessary not only to achieve important national goals, but also to undergird national unity in the event of a severe crisis. This cooperation depends both on congressional leaders who will act to set aside partisan advantage and on administration officials who understand the benefits of having the support of Congress is worth the effort and political capital it takes to secure that support. Now, I hope and pray with all of you that this spirit will prevail in the coming weeks and months. I believe that our system of government, our traditions, our individual leaders can produce extraordinary outcomes for the betterment of our country. I thank all of you especially for the contributions you have made and are making to make this effort successful. And I look forward very much to our discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So there are microphones in each aisle. For those of you who would like to ask questions, we just ask that you line up and then state your name, your affiliation, and then you can ask the senator a question. While people head to the mics, why don't I start off with a question? Given that we've seen television and the media driving politics and not necessarily towards compromise, and the advent of gerrymandering has made districts more one party or the other, what do you see reversing this sort of trend towards partisanship or bringing us back together? Anything?
Well, in the latter case, California, for example, has adopted a system in which the initial election, the so-called primary election, is sort of an all-comers primary. Mm-hmm. And the two top vote-getters then face off in the fall or in the second election. Now, that means that by the very nature of this, there has to be an appeal somewhat to all of the electorate, as opposed to a more narrow part in the normal partisan primary. Right. Other states and some counties, other jurisdictions have adopted similar procedures. I think there's real value in doing this, but obviously California is a big state. The effects of this were losses by some veteran members of Congress who found themselves facing each other, quite apart from the gerrymandering and tailoring of districts that made things more partisan. As election people have pointed out, the total vote for Democrats in the Congress exceeded the total vote for Republicans in the general election of 2012. Mm-hmm. But the Republicans have a very large majority in the House. Well, how can this be? Well, it can be because of very specific tailoring of the situation. I've got so excited about that part. About the first part of the question.
Do you see, other than these open primaries, do you see other things bringing us back together?
It's a complex sort of several chapter answer, but let me just say this. Since the Supreme Court, in essence, in its wisdom, made it possible for individuals, groups, corporations to make unrestricted gifts in political campaigns, or even in a period such as the Congress meeting now, often without there being any attribution. Now, this is very different. In the old days when you're running for office, why you solicit campaign contributions, but you've got to list them all. Right. And you have reports, so-and-so has got $3 million in the bank or so forth. But in fact, what if the case were that the candidates, whatever they're raising, is dwarfed entirely, not just by the political parties of their county or their state, which also might come in, but by national groups who come into a particular district or state, overwhelming this with television advertising, often very sophisticated, with people who are, as a matter of fact, organizationally even more expert than the parties that are on the ground in terms of getting out the vote or influencing people. And so let's take an example. Often the question is, well, what about the Koch brothers or the various Republican conservative organizations? But more recently, on the other side of the coin, Mayor Bloomberg of New York got involved in a primary in the state of Illinois. Now here, young Jesse Jackson resigned, sadly, and so quickly they were going to have a primary, and a lady who was fairly well known, I gather, had been a congressional candidate before, was the obvious choice, but she didn't have the same position on gun control as Mayor Bloomberg. And so Mayor Bloomberg found another lady, and he put in so much money that it totally overwhelmed the election. His candidate won 2-1. Now here's a case where the people voted for the candidate who won. She's going to be sitting in Congress as a real result. But the effects of Mayor Bloomberg's organization and the intensity of that effort were apparent. Now, this is occurring all over America now. Even as we're talking today, the Republican Democratic Party people in the Senate, at least, have just finished their Tuesday luncheons. And these are always remarkable occasions of a lot of indigestion for a lot of people, quite apart. But they will be spilling out onto the floor shortly with a pretty good idea whether there's going to be any progress on either the gun business, immigration, the budget and taxes, any of the rest of this. But trying to help them along, I read in the press today, as many of you will, all sorts of groups already are targeting individual members. Now, this is a year and a half out from another election, and scoring them A through F. Even in the gun business, you have the NRA, but then you have the other gun owners of America, what have you, who apparently are trying to exceed the NRA to gain dominance within the gun control area, their own competition, as to who really will do the scoring and who will take out all the poor victims. Now, if you are a member of Congress, you're coming out of one of these caucuses, and you're hearing that back in your home state, even as you're meeting, television ads are being run with your own face prominently in them, right in the gun sight, so to speak. This is a rather unnerving experience. I don't know how the Congress is going to face up to this, because a good number of members like the idea of unlimited contributions. They think the court was right on. This is freedom of speech. If you've got the money here or abroad and you focus it, that's America. But it's a different kind of politics. And it's overwhelmed the political organizations, quite apart from the individual candidacies, or folks who are now going to have to vote on the floor of the Congress today.
Okay, well, why don't we, I'll start this side and then we'll go to the other side. Okay.
Thanks for being here, Senator. Is it on? My name is Andrew Bryan. I'm with the Public Policy Institute. I was wondering if you think that the issue of partisanship today on the Hill is due to the fact that political leadership or politicians on the Hill are unwilling to compromise, or do you believe that it's because the beliefs and interests of the American people have diverged so far that there are a few areas where it actually aligns? Or is it another thing like you just mentioned, interest groups?
I would say basically one reason for the current dilemma is the economic recession, and we'll call it depression, but the economic recession in our country. I would just say as a campaigner in the last 2 or 3 years, frequently, as I went to meetings out in various counties, people would make at least some generous thought that, Lugar, you've done a lot in foreign policy, but that's not what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about jobs, and we want to talk about the fact that our Social Security is in danger, and as a matter of fact, the unemployment in this area, quite apart from people who don't have jobs, everybody has a threat that they're not going to have any very shortly, and the awesome federal government that is running trillions of dollars of debt and is just a mess. So that's what we want to talk about. Well, understandably, these are very serious issues, as I mentioned in my speech today. But after you go round and around with this, there's not much production. There just simply is an expression of anguish, a feeling, maybe properly, that the congressman or the senator ought to understand and feel the anguish that is there. So after you say, I feel the anguish and so forth, there's not any discussion as to where you go from this. Right. Now, this is why the interest groups have come in, and they said, well, the problem is that there is no purity of thought about this. As a matter of fact, it's easily solved, one group would say, by cutting taxes, because that energizes people. They will invest money. They'll create jobs. They'll become more competitive. So as a result, that's what you want to do. And they would say, of course, cut government spending. This is awesome, what's happening. Do it now, not in the hereafter. And so, fair enough. These are objectives. But then come along the groups that say, now we're going to grade you on how much cutting you did, how frequently you've cut as opposed to spend something more. Mm-hmm. And so you have then all of these groups, as I say, even some competing with each other as to who will do the scoring. Well, if you're an individual member of Congress, you really are sort of battening down the hatches, sort of hoping somehow the storm will pass. But the storm doesn't pass. It's been going on for 5 years or so. The leaders are no different in this. The leaders who are in the caucuses today, these luncheons, have a sense, really, of their own survival or lack of it in the process. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to read what the troops are going to do, and furthermore, what the troops in the other house are going to do. And so you ask the leader, what is our stance today? Well, he says, we're discussing this. We're still working it out. So there isn't any leadership. Right. This is why I suggested in my remarks today that at the top, President Obama really has to offer leadership, and I'm glad he's offering a budget tomorrow. I gave credit where credit is due, that some Republicans have found, at least in rumors, of something in that budget that might be the beginning of a conversation. But, and I cited the entitlement situation. Mm-hmm. Having said that, in the press today, there were groups in our society that were saying not one dime of cuts, changes in any entitlement. Right. Medicare, Social Security, this is almost like biblical writ. It's not amendable and so forth. And the president feels that. So do all the leaders of Congress, for that matter.
My name is Chris Adams. I am also a student at the Public Policy Institute. And my question was about that you mentioned the importance of, or at least the potential problem of shortages in the global food supply in the coming years. And my question was on whether the extent to which you thought that domestic agricultural policies such as subsidies for food and ethanol production, or requirements that food aid be produced locally or domestically and shipped abroad, whether that stunts agricultural productivity growth self-sufficiency in other countries?
Well, I'll try to separate the question a little bit because, as a matter of fact, you're on to a point that is going to be discussed tomorrow by Raj Shah, who is head of USAID. The administration, pardon me, is going to adopt a new policy, or at least suggested, that the United States assistance ought to buy food in the country that is being helped, close by to the people that are starving or that are in need of the food, as opposed to the current policy, which is usually to buy production from this country, ship it in American ships, that's usually specified in the legislation, and then find some distribution system within the country, often with a lapse of 6, 7, or 8 months between the time that some emergency panic has been suggested and the food actually arrives. Now, it's not by chance things worked out this way. I'm sure the compromise was that if American dollars are going to go to help buy food for other people and we want to help them, then we ought to get some value. And farmers said, you ought to buy it from us. And American shippers said, these are jobs for us to ship all of this food, as a matter of fact. The question now is, at a time in which food aid may very well be cut, along with most foreign aid, which has been in that situation, how do you get the most value to the people who you're trying to save? And I think, without being absolute about it, I think the odds are that we probably had better purchase more food abroad and help create, therefore, more agricultural practices abroad that might be more sustainable. I touched upon a very controversial issue in my remarks today, genetically modified seed or fertilizer or any genetically modified product. For Europeans, this is entirely out of bounds. And as a result, much of the food shortages in Africa come from the fact that Europeans say we will not accept any exports from Africa that in any way are touched by genetically modified. And as a result, Africans, therefore, have stayed with other practices. I just reached back, and from my own history, I have a 604-acre farm I managed for our family in Indiana. When I was a boy, my dad was getting about 40 bushels to the acre of corn. We regularly get 160 bushels now, 4 times in my lifetime increase. And it's entirely because of new production methods that came out of Purdue and other institutions of this sort. And a lot of it has the GMO aspect to it. But this is a worldwide battle, to be truthful. So all I'm saying is that we're going to have some missionary work in some of these countries to help get a sustainable situation. If, as a farmer now, and I'm interested in the price of corn, read ag newsletters every day. Corn and soybeans in this country during the past year were at all-time records. Farm acreage values have been increasing by leaps and bounds, thank goodness, even in the midst of a recession. Why? Because there is huge, huge international demand for our food. Therefore, the necessity of putting on additional monies here in the United States is certainly questionable, as are, for that matter, a number of subsidy situations. And yet, we were unable to pass a farm bill last year. Senate passed a bill. The House refused even to talk about it. As a result, we're back to outmoded practices years ago as various parts fall out due to limits. It's a long answer, but it's an important one because let me just state it very frankly. When the Arab Spring came, people, rightly so, young people, just as we are today in this room, were out in the streets saying that we need better jobs, we need progression, we're not being recognized, and they've often an energy for a turnover. But they're sort of out of the picture now, and in part it's because the real unrest in the country came, as in Egypt, for example, with 80 million people back in the hustings, where there were millions that were on the verge of starvation. Hosni Mubarak, as a totalitarian, or however you want to characterize him, was at least astute enough to know he had to get money or food out to these people to stay alive politically. And that was true of each of these situations. And in Saudi Arabia, they still are able to provide food subsidies, in quotes, to try to take care of these situations. All I'm saying is that in country after country, frequently the political instability is going to come basically from starvation, from the most primitive need, quite apart from a discussion of the politics. Now, you may get Shiites and Sunnis and others involved in it, trying to take advantage of it. But our foreign policy really has to be one of trying to feed the world and trying to bring about not only a humane solution, but a reasonably stable one through these humanitarian efforts. And I think the new policies at least make the best use of the money we have now. I hope that there will be more coming. And I respect Rod Shaw as the head of USAID as a remarkable leader in this respect.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for coming here. My name is Joe Laposada. I'm a freshman undergrad here, and I'm also an intern on the House side of the Capitol. I see every day the effects of gerrymandering, which you mentioned, and it does very much contribute to partisanship in the House. But in the Senate, which is effectively immune from this, I'm curious your opinion. Is the onus for uncooperative Senates, is that on the people for electing too partisan a candidate, or is it on the Senate for not overcoming its partisanship if the state votes for a partisan candidate?
Mm-hmm. I think currently the situation is one in which the search, at least from the Republican Party, for so-called purity has brought about a situation in which there are very few Republicans that might be in a colloquy with Democrats across the aisle. And to be caught in being involved in this sort of thing, it could be fatal as you get the grades from the various groups of people that are going to come into your state with the millions to wipe you out. Now, on the Democratic side, there's some of this, but less so. I think most of the polling that I've seen indicates that probably there are on the Democratic side more, quote, moderates. Maybe it's because they have some loyalty to the president or hoping to make his administration a more successful one with a greater legacy. But I think this is just the nature, really, of the political system for the moment. Now, Republicans could change. For example, the so-called autopsy report that was produced by the Republican National Committee indicated that without Republicans taking a very hard look at the demographics of this country and their own states or their own districts, and by that they meant how many women are voting for Republican candidates, how many people of Hispanic background, how many people who are African American, how many people of this and that and so forth. And now, even after, as you say that, some Republicans will say, well, when people find out the truth, whether they're Hispanic or female or what have you, they will come with us because there's almost a visionary theological idea that this is so apparent that the country is going to hell in a handbasket that you simply have to come with us. But there are others who are more pragmatic about the future, including the National Republican Committee. And this is why we have this interesting contest. Will the Republican National Committee or the State Committee of Indiana or the local Marion County Republican organization be the prevalent factor, or will they in fact be simply wiped out by the other interests coming in who have the money and have the organization? And these are the kinds of questions that I don't think have been raised sufficiently, and maybe there was not a reason to do so prior to there being unlimited political finance and these abilities really for people to participate in every state and every county if they wish to do so.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Senator. My name's Stephen Taft. I'm a senior undergraduate studying history here at Georgetown. So glad to have you here. So what I was wondering, sir, is if you could perhaps walk us through a sort of textbook example of a case where where compromise didn't work out so great. Like I was thinking, you know, I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that we weren't totally happy with how the fiscal cliff deal worked out. It was kind of 11th hour, you know, there was a tax increase, there was, you know, it was better than the fiscal cliff, but not a whole lot better. And I think, you know, most of us were so sorry that you weren't there to help out with it at that point. But I was wondering, as a bystander to that crisis, what were some of the ways both parties could have done things better? How could they have come up with a more solid deal? Mm-hmm.
Well, with the fiscal cliff we're talking about, I think it is the one you're talking about. Was
the most recent one
at the beginning of the year?
Yeah. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in fairness, I was still around for that one.
Oh, excuse me.
So I can't opt out. Maybe therefore
I'm sorry.
you have to sort of discount the answer. But I would say that I really admired the fact that on that particular occasion, behind the scenes, Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell got together and tried to figure out something that would get us past the fiscal cliff. The president was not prepared really to get involved in this. Maybe he felt burned by the last times he had tried. The House people were not very enthusiastic about all this going on. But you may be right, the effects were limited and you would like to have seen a lot more happen. But the fact that anything happened, that we did not suffer all the aspects that were very apparent, seemed to me to be semi-miraculous at the time. And so I must say that this is one occasion where our leader, Mitch McConnell, I think was on the right track. And I admired the fact that he proceeded, and likewise Joe Biden. I think that the dilemma, obviously, is that having passed the fiscal cliff thing with the tax increase on individuals that are earning $400,000 or more, or couples $450,000 or more, that some Republicans said, no, that's it with regard to taxes. No touching of that at all. And Democrats had taken the position all along that there would be no touching at all of Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, what have you. Going back, for instance, to Paul Ryan's plan a year and a half ago or so. The Ryan plan, which was a bold attempt to change the deficit situation, had a mention of Medicare. And by and large, this so oversimplifies, but if you're 55 and over, you would have the same Medicare plan as we have now. 55 and under, there would be a new plan that would be substantially different. And there would be a lot of money saved over the course of time, at least Ryan calculated in this. Well, immediately when Paul Ryan and the House proposed this, Harry Reid, the Democratic leader in the Senate, said, aha, we've got you now. And he said, I'm going to propose on the Senate floor the Ryan plan. Going to be the Reid plan. And I'm going to ask all you Republicans have to vote on this now. And we're going to really put you to the test. Well, I voted for the Ryan plan, but I was one of 8 Republicans in the Senate, as I recall, who did so. And as a result, it failed, and Harry Reid made his point that there was not going to be any change in any entitlement. Now we're sort of back to that, as I mentioned in my remarks today, sort of at the edges. The president has said maybe with the cost of living for some entitlement plans in the future, it might be somewhat less than whatever it is. That's a very small opening, but to make your point, people would say, well, my goodness, to go through hell in a handbasket for just that hardly seems worthwhile. All I'm saying is to get any compromise, to get any change, given the polarization of this sort, is really an achievement. And I'm going to applaud almost anybody who has the political courage, really, to move in that direction.
Thank you, Senator, and I'm sorry for getting my dates wrong.
That's all right. You have one of the interesting features, no reason you need to know much about this, but I found out when I was retiring that I received 3 days of pay for 2013. So I'll have to file another
Disclosure reform?
yes, for income in 2013. But there you are.
Thank you for being here, Senator. I would just like to ask about something that's a little more into your expertise, and that is on foreign relations and especially WMDs. I'd like to get your opinion on the conflict and crisis in Syria, and that if it were to escalate to the point where chemical weapons were or are, or there's rumors, have been used, if the UN can't get together and act, should the U.S. do anything to intervene? Are we ready for another war in the Middle East? What is your opinion on that, sir?
Well, my opinion was expressed when I was in Moscow in August to Russians. I said I'd come over there really to try to see if we could get some agreement on extending what is essentially a part of the non-Lugar program that gives an exemption for Americans who are in Russia working on these problems, either as military people or as civilians. And that may or may not occur, the so-called umbrella agreement. But while I was there, I suggested in their Defense Department, as well as their Foreign Office, that both Russia and the United States have great respect for each other. We have worked together under the non-Lugar program to destroy the chemical weapons of both of our countries. Out at a place called Sucha in Siberia, even as we're sitting here today, they literally are putting nerve gas into a solution. They call it bituminization, some solidifying it, burying it in the ground. They're going to be at this for several more years, but they will, in fact, destroy all of their chemical weapons. That's the agreement, as we will. And so we have experience in this. Now, the Russians always have a feeling we don't have respect sufficiently for them and their ability to deal with this. So I said, now we have a great dilemma, I think, with the Syrian chemical weapons. At some point, prayerfully, they will not be used by the Syrians, but they may fall into other hands as the Syrian situation disintegrates. So what I'd like to say is the United States military officials and the Russians ought to be preparing now for those times in which the two of us, two countries, might literally seize the chemical weapons and destroy them on behalf of both of our country's security and the world. The Russians didn't reject that, and so I made it a public point of it in the Moscow press while we were there. Our people over here are still rather silent about the question, but my hope is that they are working on it, because absent that, there is likely to be the problem, literally, of the carting off of various chemicals by various factions in Syria or others in other countries that are fairly close by. And that will be a real threat to the health and safety of the world at that point.
That's practical and pragmatic. Thank you, sir.
So we have time for one last question. I'm sorry. Good.
Great. Thank you very much for being here, Senator. Good afternoon. My name is Nick Martinez. I'm a Master of Public Policy student here at Georgetown.
Yes.
Over the course of the past several years, support for marriage for gay and lesbian couples has been increasing rapidly on a bipartisan basis. 58% of Americans today support marriage for gay and lesbian couples. Younger Americans support it even more than that. With the Supreme Court likely to overturn the Defense of Marriage Act as it seems right now, a number of senators have been coming out in favor of marriage for gay and lesbian couples, citing their own evolving on the subject, reconciling their traditional views and religious views with their compassion for their friends and family. I would like to know I would really appreciate if you would share with us your own views on marriage for gay and lesbian couples and how your views have changed over the years on gay and lesbian people in general, and how your relationships have evolved with gay and lesbian people over the course of your lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Well, that stretches way back the course of the lifetime. I would just say that I have respect for people who have made choices. My own view is that ideally marriage should be a man and a woman, and the possibility, therefore, of their producing children and families. But I certainly respect that there are others who have other points of view, and therefore would not be in a position of wanting to offer further legislation or court orders or what have you to prevent their exercising that.
Thank you.
Okay. Senator, thank you. This has been very
thank you,
fascinating.
Dean.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.